Hey guys, Heidi Prieb here. Earlier this week on this channel, we talked about what to do if you can't afford therapy or what resources you can draw on if, for whatever reason, therapy is not accessible to you. Today, I wanted to make a follow-up video for those of you who are looking to start a therapy journey and who don't necessarily know where to start or how to find a therapist that fits for you. So the first time I ever went to a therapist, I was 15 years old, and I went to a therapist who was kind of the only one available through my parents' insurance, and I had no rapport with this person. I felt like they didn't get me, they weren't specialized in the area that I needed help with, and it just absolutely flopped. And I had this experience 2 more times in my 20s. I went to see therapists for periods of 6 months and learned next to nothing from the experiences. One I got a little bit more out of than the other, but at the end of the day, I felt like the help that I was getting was not the help I needed. It was the help that was most accessible to me at that time. So it was the cheapest help, the most readily available help, but at the end of the day, I did end up feeling like I had kind of flushed some money down the toilet. And this wasn't all the therapist's fault. I was also at a point where I wasn't quite ready to engage honestly with therapy. And in my other video on therapy inaccessibility, we talk about that as a factor that might get in the way of you accessing therapy. And there's a lot of work you can do around readying yourself if you feel like you might someday want therapy, but know that right now you're not quite ready to take that leap. But all that being said, at this point in my life, I have a fantastic therapist who I benefit immensely through working with. And I really believe that that experience is possible for anyone who's able to access therapy if you know how to find the right therapist. So today we're going to talk about how to do that. Something I think we don't acknowledge enough is the fact that there are a lot of bad therapists out there. Just like there are people in every single profession who are just not that skilled at their job, there are many therapists who, for whatever reason, are not that skilled at therapy, or perhaps they're going through a season of their life where they're very burnt out, they're not able to show up to the extent that they should be able to show up for their clients. And it's really important to note that if therapy is not working for you, but you feel like you are truly bringing your all to it, it might be that you have the wrong therapist and that it's time to look for a new one. So, the number one piece of advice that I always give people is get the research phase right. So be as specific as possible about which issues you really want to tackle and work through, and then find a therapist who is doing research or actively putting out consistent information related to that field. Whether that means they have a YouTube channel or a blog or some other way of getting information out into the world. And the reason that I recommend this is because that shows that they are actively engaged with their own material. So just like any other profession, therapy can become just another 9-to-5 job for people. There are some therapists out there who get educated one time and then they practice therapy without ever really staying that up to date on the new information. But just like in any field, there are also people who are in it for the absolute love of it and who are consistently learning and reading and trying to gain more and more information about their own field because they truly want to get down to the bottom of it. They are inherently engaged in the mysteries that they are tackling in their work. And that is the kind of therapist you want. You want a therapist who is naturally and intrinsically motivated to understand the human mind. So the 2 times in my life that I've ever found good therapists, one I saw for 3 sessions when I was 25 and was like, that's all you need with therapy, right? 3 sessions. But he was fantastic. And the therapist that I have been with for a while now is absolutely fantastic as well. And both of them I found by looking for people who were actively putting out resources related to the problems that I was facing. So the first therapist I ever found who worked out really well for me, I found a research paper that he had published on the specific topic that I was struggling with. And then I contacted him and just asked, hey, do you do therapy? Do you see clients? It so happened that he did. The therapist I have now, I found through blog articles, and I found this person's writing to be very engaging, very accessible, and also I learned quite a bit through reading it. So once again, I contacted them to see if they took on clients, got put on a wait list for a little while, figured it was worth it because I really felt like I wanted to learn from this person, and ended up benefiting immensely through their help, and I continue to benefit. So this is kind of the number one thing that I consider to be a therapy hack. Find someone whose research or whose knowledge base you already connect with before you even meet them, and there's a very high chance that you're going to connect with them as a person as well. Because again, if they can communicate through writing or through videos or whatever it is in a way that really speaks to you, chances are that means that you're going to relate to them as a human being as well. And again, if they're putting out that stuff, it means there's a higher chance that they are really invested and really knowledgeable and really interested in continuing their own development as a therapist. So tip number 1, start with the research or resources that you find helpful, and then figure out who the people behind them are and see whether those people take clients. Tip number 2 is know how to interview your therapists. So I always recommend that people go to 2 to 5 consultations at least with different therapists before deciding on who they want to work with. And a lot of people are very nervous about saying no. They don't want to turn therapists down, but therapists understand more than anybody else, or at least they should understand more than anybody else, that client-therapist fit is incredibly important. And they probably don't want to work with a client who feels like they're a bad fit for them, right? So don't worry about hurt feelings in this process. Have consultation calls with as many therapists as you feel like you need to. Most of them will offer 20 or 30-minute calls just to see if you're the right fit for each other. And you need to be using that time to ask them the questions that you really need answered. So your goal within this consultation session is to make sure that they're going to be able to help you with the things that you need help with. So a lot of the time, people will go to, let's say, a site like Psychology Today, which can be a great resource for finding different therapists, but the therapist will have like 20 different modalities listed. So let's say you really want to find a therapist who works with attachment styles. Most therapists will actually have that listed, but whether or not that means that they have a deep understanding of attachment styles and how it shows up for people is something else entirely. It could mean they took one class on it one time and have only a base level understanding of it. And the same is true for most things that are listed. So you have to figure out within this consultation call, is this therapist actually extremely well informed in the area that I want to do work on? Or is it just something that they know a little bit about and that they might integrate into whatever their primary form of therapy is? So it's not only okay, but I highly encourage you to directly ask the therapist that you're speaking with, I am mostly looking to work on this one thing. Is that something you specialize in? Or what's your background in that area? You can also ask for clarification about some of the language that they might have put on their profile. So if they put that they are trauma informed, you can ask them, what does that mean to you? Pure knowledge is not the most important thing when it comes to finding a therapist. I think that fit is the most important thing, and we're going to talk about fit shortly. But having a wide knowledge base in the particular area that you want to work on is probably the second most important thing. Because you want someone who doesn't just have an understanding of what it is that you want to work on, you want someone who can catch you in all of your BS around it. And in order to catch someone in their BS, you have to know a lot about how the system works. So knowing what anxious avoidant and fearful avoidant attachment styles are is very different than, for example, knowing how to show up as a therapist when working with a dismissive avoidant client versus an anxious preoccupied client. Because the way that you are going to need to show up in those therapeutic relationships are going to need to be specifically catered to those styles. It also means you're going to need an awareness of your own attachment style and how that might bias you. Now that's an example for if you're looking for an attachment-based therapist, but let's say you're looking for a trauma-based therapist. Again, a therapist who knows about trauma is different than a therapist who specializes in trauma and is able to identify when you're having a trigger, when you're in an emotional flashback, which of the presenting problems that you're bringing into therapy are actually just a symptom of a deeper trauma response. So there are going to be blind spots for therapists who are informed but not entrenched in the thing that you need to work on. So you want to try to find a therapist who is, as much as possible, entrenched in the field that you need help with, because they're going to have more of a 360-degree view on that topic, and that's what you're looking for. Another thing that is totally okay during a therapy interview is to ask them about allyship. So if you are a person of color, if you are queer or not cisgendered, it's totally okay to ask, what does being an ally mean to you? And if they're a person who has done a lot of work in this area and really taken the time to dedicate themselves to understanding which issues their clients might be facing that they don't necessarily face as a person who is not a part of that group, they will be able to answer that question for you. And if they can't answer it in a way that you feel is satisfactory, it probably means they're not the best person for you to work with, and that's okay. You should be working with someone who's going to be able to understand the context in which you are showing up in the world. That's really important. And it's also more than okay to try to seek out a therapist who is a part of the same groups that you're a part of, so they already understand some of the unique challenges that you're facing in the world. It's also okay if, let's say, you have religious trauma, to ask your therapist whether they identify with a particular religion. I don't think they have to answer that legally, but if they're willing to, that can give you a lot of information about whether or not that's someone who maybe you're going to feel safe with. So I think that a lot of people shy away from these really hard questions during therapeutic interviews. And again, your therapist doesn't necessarily have to answer all of these things, but do you want to work with someone who isn't comfortable going there? Maybe you don't, right? So you move on with your interviewing process. Third thing to look for in a therapist, and in my opinion, this is absolutely the most important, is having rapport with them as a human being. So I think that a lot of people have this vision in their heads of therapy as a purely transactional experience where you go to someone who has knowledge, kind of like you go to a doctor and they tell you the knowledge and then you get better from taking their advice. But that's really not what therapy is. Therapy is a relationship with another human being. And a lot of what makes it so powerful is that we are rewiring the way that we relate to someone through having a very healthy experience with a therapist. So if you are trying to rewire the way that you relate to other human beings through a relationship with someone who you don't naturally get along with very well, that is probably not going to give you the results that you're looking for. So early on in my therapy journey, the way I ended up wasting 6 months of therapy at one point was by finding a therapist who was kind of the opposite of me, because I thought, well, I want to cultivate these traits in myself that are kind of the opposite of who I am now. So I'm going to find a therapist who embodies all of those qualities, and then I'm going to hope that they get transmuted into my brain. And what ended up happening is that I had a therapist who just didn't really understand the way that I was naturally wired. And there was absolutely nothing wrong with this therapist. I actually think she would have been a fantastic therapist for someone else. But because all of my work with her was me kind of fighting against my natural tendencies, rather than working with someone who understood my natural tendencies and could help me work with them holistically, I got absolutely nowhere in that therapy. Just wasted my own time and money. And now looking back, it is so clear to me that you are supposed to have a human-to-human connection with your therapist. You are supposed to sit in a room with them or sit with them on Zoom and just feel like this is a human being who I point blank enjoy the company of. So think of the qualities that anyone who you would both look up to and feel connected to would have, and search for those in a therapist. Like, I know that for myself, I feel very connected to people who are very analytical because I'm very analytical, who have a sense of humor because I have a sense of humor and I process a lot in my life through that sense of humor. For me personally, I also struggle with authorities who are kind of a blank slate. That makes me really uncomfortable. So I need a therapist who talks a little bit more, who is a little bit more open about who they are as a human being behind their professional veneer. And of course, there are professional boundaries that a therapist needs to have in place. But you also have to know your preference for, like, therapist who talks a little bit more or a little bit less, therapist who's a little bit more formal or a little bit more informal. And for a lot of people, this is just similar to how they pick people to be friends with, to spend their time with outside of therapy, right? Therapists are people, they have personalities, right? We talk a lot on this channel about personality. Figure out which personality traits make you feel comfortable opening up to someone and look for those traits in your therapist as a human being. Because at the end of the day, someone can have all of the knowledge on earth, but if you do not have a human-to-human connection with them, that knowledge is not going to impact you the way that it otherwise could. Because maybe you're just going to feel like you're being lectured to, right? Therapy is about healing through relationship. So you need to find a therapist that you feel comfortable in relationship with. And you have to trust your gut here. You just have to. There's no other way about it. If you are sitting in front of a therapist and they're saying all the right things, they're answering all of your questions in the interview with the exact answer you want to hear, and yet something in your gut is just telling you, I don't really feel like this is someone that I can learn from and grow with, listen to your gut. Keep interviewing, keep looking for people. You will find a therapist somewhere along the way who you have a natural sense of rapport with. And of course, this doesn't mean that right away everything is going to be perfect. Like any relationship, it takes a long time for your therapist to get to know you and for you to get comfortable with them. But just like when you're meeting people out in the wild, out in your everyday life, you tend to get a pretty quick sense of who's a person you could connect with and who's a person you're probably not going to connect with. You are going to feel that same sense when you're interviewing therapists. Trust it. Trust it. That is the number one piece of advice I can give you. Finding the right fit in terms of therapist is absolutely everything. It is probably going to be the single most important factor in whether or not the therapy ends up working for you. Your therapist has to have the specific kind of intelligence that you need in order to get better, right? So in the process of picking a therapist who's going to be really helpful for you, my 3 recommendations are: do your research, ask the hard and direct questions, and really tune into how you feel when you're speaking with them and make sure that rapport is really there for you. If you can get those things right, you have laid down a really solid foundation for yourself that you can now start building on through your work in therapy. All right, that's all I have to say for today. But as always, if you have any tips on how to find a great therapist, or if you have any advice to share on what worked for you, please leave it in the comments. I love when you guys share resources with each other because that is how so many of us learn. So please let me know your thoughts and any advice you have about how to find a good therapist below. And in the meantime, I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves, and I will see you back here again soon.